Hi, I'm Anjali Alapat, the host of Arcx, a series about literary inspiration. I have loved fantasy and sci-fi for as long as I can remember. In these strange times, these stories are a wonderful form of escape. Doorways to different worlds, offering glimpses into possible futures. In this first series, I'm going to be talking to 6 celebrated writers of speculative fiction from South Asia to find out what really made them want to tell stories. We're going to talk about books, TV shows, radio dramas, podcasts, and movies that shaped and influenced them as writers. Today, we're talking to one of India's best-known sci-fi and fantasy authors, Samit Basu. An incredibly versatile writer, Samit's work has spanned mediums with comic books, film scripts, and children and YA novels. Samit's first novel, The Simoquin Prophecies, was published in 2003 when he was just 23. It evolved into the best-selling Gameworld Trilogy. His latest novel, The City Inside, was shortlisted for a JCB Prize for Literature in 2020. We chat with Samit about how he got started as a writer, his refusal to be bound by genre, and the not-so-distant future depicted in his novel. Hi, Samit. Thank you so much for joining us today on Arcx.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So to start with, I wanted to ask you about your journey as a writer. How did you get started? Was this always what you wanted to do?
Yeah, it was always what I wanted to do, but as in, how the journey as a writer happened is something that I'm not very aware of, because it was mostly, successive states of ignorance about everything involved in the process. So it started, I would say, around 20 years ago, when in my clueless youth, as opposed to my clueless middle age now, I went to business school because it was the thing that people in my generation did when they didn't know what to do with their lives, but were vaguely good in studies. Having gotten there, I knew that I didn't want to be there. And always wanted was to write books. But at the time, you didn't write books if you were Indian and not among the very small circles of people who wrote books. And I was not them and I had no connection to them. So it was always one of the things where one day I want to write a book. But I had also promised myself that if I had an idea for a book, I would drop whatever I was doing and write that book. Unfortunately, this happened at, I think, the end of my first week in business school. So I then dropped out of business school, went home to Calcutta and wrote the book. And then on publishing's eternal slow timeline, they told me about a year later that the book would come out. So I dropped whatever my plans were then, which was to become a journalist, and then moved to Delhi and then kept writing novels. That was the journey of how I started. And then over almost 2 decades, I think I've lost count of how many books there have been. There have been either 10 or 11. But apart from that, there's been 200 failed projects in comics and films and a few successful ones as well, and 2-3 other media. So it's been endless, really, and it's been multi-directional, and it's just been a process of being extremely ignorant about how things work and finding out through falling into holes and then deciding not to fall into the same holes again.
And you'd mentioned other mediums. So can you tell us a bit about that and how that compares to writing a novel?
Well, to compress it conveniently, I will say that books give you freedom that nothing else does. And with any other medium, whether it's comics, when it's about 5-6 other people involved, or in film, where it's about 500-600 other people involved, you get to experience the joy of collaboration, but you also get to experience the challenges of collaboration, which in a country as chaotic in India, in any industry, are always slightly extreme, because the field has inherent complications and challenges, whatever it is. What I want to do at all times is to be in a bunker writing books. So, but the problem with that is that you can't afford to exit the bunker, and you might not have a bunker in the first place. So at some point you have to go out and earn a living. So I kind of bounce around where I write books until I run out of money. Then I work in other mediums until I run out of sanity. And I require the cold clarity of just sitting at a computer and typing until I run out of money again. So that's been my life. I make it sound worse than it is. I've actually had a really good time doing all of this and met lovely people, and so I've had a much better experience than most people have, which is that they mostly run into the lack of income or the lack of sanity, and they go back to doing like real things.
I love that you call it real things.
Yeah, because this is absurd, right? Doing this for a living is absurd in the first place. Doing this for a living for 2 decades is beyond absurd. So I recognize that I'm extremely lucky to have been able to do that. But it's not real. It's a collection of bubbles, and I'm very happy to be in them.
So you've written extensively in both fantasy and sci-fi. And I wanted to ask you what media, like books, TV, movies, what inspired you and had like a big influence on your storytelling?
So this is a hard question because, I don't know what it was like for people in your generation, but in mine, we didn't have bookstores that were segregated by genre, and we didn't have a lot of internet. Like, we had dial-up internet when I was growing up, and that was also in my mid to late teens. Before that, we just had offline behavior. So I didn't understand for the longest time what genre was. Like, I thought that SF and fantasy were useful ways to describe books. But I didn't understand that there were whole other partitions of literature and, different camps. When I wrote my first novel, I didn't know. I knew it was a fantasy novel, but I didn't know that in writing a fantasy novel, I was doing something fundamentally different from writing any other kind of novel, because I didn't read like that. I've always read across genres. I've always watched, consumed, read, seen across media. So it's always been very fluid, which I think also shows up in my work. So in terms of fantasy and SF influences, I would have to say that at the point where I started writing, Terry Pratchett was certainly a huge influence, because I'd consumed many of his books in the same way that I'd consumed, say, P.G. Wodehouse or Agatha Christie or Georgette Heyer or other writers where you have to read one book and then you have to read 100 books. Enid Blyton earlier in life, Asterix, Tintin, all of that. So definitely Pratchett. But what showed up in my first book, I think, was a skeleton that was very clearly inspired and projected inspired by Pratchett, but also contained such influences as, say, Douglas Adams, definitely Tolkien. Tolkien I fell into when I was 11 or 12 years old. I reread The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings so many times. I was obsessed with them. I think I read Foundation when I was in my early teens as well, but I admired the scale of it, but I didn't really get it. Like, nothing much really happened, right? People just talk a lot and there are big planets. So I loved it, but it wasn't foundational to me in the same way as, say, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was, which I loved and fell into in the same way. So in terms of formative SF fantasy influences, I would say those, but I would also say a world myth, because again, since as Indians, you don't consume in the same way that genre fans in the US or the UK or Germany or anywhere else do, and you don't consume in a segregated manner, world myth, Indian myth, Arthurian legends, movies. I was a big Monty Python fan in my teens. So it was, I would say, 200 different influences, with Pratchett being a very clearly identifiable one, Douglas Adams being another, Monty Python being another. I think it's only gotten worse in the sense that it's become 2,000 other influences. And now with the situation we're currently in, with shows and anime and comics and all of that being available, I'm completely unable to identify what my influences currently are. But I do know that they are contemporary influences more than they are classical or canonical in any sense, because I never got to catch up on the backstory of SF or fantasy. Once I was in it and once I was like, oh, I'm a fantasy writer, it seems I should find out what that is. Or I write science fiction, oh, I should know what science fiction is. Just the volume and quality of contemporary work in any field, in any medium, has been so much that my poor, weak brain has not been able to keep in touch with all of it and also go back into history and find out where everything came from. Because I've also made my life much more difficult by working in multiple fields. So I now have the responsibility of, staying abreast of film and TV and books and comics. So I've just given up on some of them.
I think that's very understandable. And I do feel like the volume of things that are coming out today is so much more, or perhaps we have more access to it than we ever did before. And it's also funny to me that you mentioned Tolkien and Douglas Adams, because I do feel like that's kind of a theme on this podcast, that a lot of people really found a lot of solace in their work.
It's also a question of access, like I just said. Like, if you're talking to Indian writers who are not in their 20s, but the work that they have been introduced to and exposed to in their youth tend to be much the same, I think, if the people giving them those links were people who were pre-broadband in any way, right? So I think for people who are growing up now, there'd be a lot more fan fiction, there'd be a lot more contemporary US work. But for people who are in their 30s and above, the books you're handed down would be these.
I find it interesting you mentioned fan fiction, because that's still kind of conversation that I have with other writers, and it's regarded very differently by a lot of them, because a lot of people are quite dismissive of it. A lot of people think it's kind of derivative. Like you said, a lot of younger writers, that's kind of how they got started. And that's how they were exposed to some of the classics or big contemporary works. So how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I feel envious really because first of all, I do not dismiss fan fiction. I think it's wonderful, but I've also not been able to consume it in the kind of way I wanted to when I first heard about it. I heard about it late. I heard about fan fiction once I'd already been published, right? And when I was just becoming aware of how much I had to catch up on. And the how much you have to catch up on has never diminished. It's only increased, right? And how far you are behind on just knowing what's happening in your field has only increased over the last 2 decades. So all I know about fan fiction really is that a lot of my favorite working writers now, who I have the privilege of being friends with over the internet, started out writing fan fiction. As far as fan fiction is concerned, I only have respect for it because it has given the world some of the biggest writers that are currently writing.
Well, before we get too carried away, I want to go back to Pratchett. And what about him as a writer really struck a chord with you?
I think fundamentally it was that he was very inclusive. I think what I first liked about Pratchett was this sense of it not being very important that you spoke secret codes, and that combination of really dark things, but also really funny things all coexisting in the same place. And what was fundamental to your reading and your liking of it was that you got straight to the humanity of the people concerned, even if they were not human at all, right? And that combination of being very funny, but also being very angry and very thoughtful, and dealing with really serious issues and really interesting issues and really complex issues in this very simple and very kind of slightly angry, but always warm-hearted way, it really draws you in. You know, it kind of gently leads you into the world and then hits you on the head with something.
I think that's a perfect description of his work.
You don't even notice, but you've read 10 books. And the books don't even have to individually be show-stopping, explosive. They don't have to have, say, your Matrixy moments, like Neo bending backwards as the bullets fly over him. I love those moments, but Pratchett doesn't have those moments. It's more like you've come into someone's house, but the house is breaking down, and now you're also helping fix the leaks. So I love being kind of drawn into the work of writers like that. When you look at the whole range and scope of the stuff he's covered, it's amazing. I don't know whether I can call it an influence of my first book because I'd only started reading Gaiman at around the time the book was published. But the scope of the Sandman comics, right? It's so diverse, so complex, but also it's very gentle and very accepting to readers. There's no visa requirement to read the Sandman. There's some things that where you know what it's about, something that you don't, but it's all very welcoming and it's all very dazzling. So there are things that science fiction, fantasy can do with aplomb that other branches of culture cannot, or at least cannot with the same degree of confidence, that need to not justify yourself or not explain yourself, but whoops, we're now in the dimension of death and there is, I don't know, talking parrot. It's something that kept me in SF and fantasy after I found out what they were.
And I think with both Pratchett and Gaiman, I mean, they're contemporaries and clearly had influence on each other and have collaborated together as well, is that they had a very rich sense of world building in very dramatically different ways, but clearly very important to both their work. I see that a lot in your writing as well. Can you tell us a bit about your process of world building?
So what I tend to do with books is that I have these extremely complicated folders, sidebars, and a vast set of notes at a conspiracy theory level. I keep adding to them, and some of the ideas that go into each book are, 15 years old and have not gone into any previous books, but those notes have kind of accumulated into a small mountain. And I actively dread starting to read them again, which I have to do. So I do get fairly intense with my world building, but it's also more like I'm just wandering around the world, making notes whenever I have an idea from anywhere, whether it's real life or fiction. Sometimes there will be some spark and I'll quickly note it down in some obsessive way and I'll add it to the ever-growing pile of things. I don't see world building as being fundamentally different from plotting or from character design or from any other aspect of the creative process. At some point, decisions have to be made and specific characters and settings and plot lines and themes and all of that have to be drawn out. And that's the part that gets difficult. because usually that's the part where I'm confronted with a Wikipedia scale. Now I should stop fooling around and I should get to work. So when I decide to do that, it's usually not a very linear process. At some point of time, there will be something, whether it's a character or a setting or a theme or a mood or something that tells me this is what the book is going to be about. By that time, usually I have a small amount of notes to go through. So it's a question of skimming through those notes and finding out which of those would be relevant for this. So it's a question more of world selection rather than of building.
Do you draw inspiration from things that you kind of observe about the world around you, or is it like things that you read in terms of like myths or history?
It varies from book to book. Like City Inside is completely observed. So everything in the world, whether it's the people in it or the things they do, the fields they work in, the settings they work in, and the things that happen to them, is completely drawn from real life and the news. That was a very extreme degree of observational work for me. Gameworld was pretty much bit. I will have another country here. Here are 5 things about that country. So there will be houses. There will be different species. That was much more kind of making stuff up out of nothing. And The City Inside is the exact opposite of that. Depends on what the starting idea for the book is. All the other aspects of it kind of just fit in. Like for the next few books I'm going to write, which I kind of vaguely know what they are, half to 2/3 of the world building is already done.
Your initial series, the Gameworld Trilogy, was like this fantasy epic, and you've kind of made slow shift towards sci-fi, I think. Was that a conscious choice, or is that just kind of something that resonates with you more now?
It wasn't super conscious, and I don't think I've ever kind of made a shift towards any particular direction so much as I've pottered into another neighboring room. With The City Inside, I did not know what genre it was. I knew it wasn't fantasy. So in India, when it came out as Chosen Spirits, for example, I didn't talk a lot about sci-fi at all, which was a good idea because it got me a nicely prestigious Litfic Award nomination with the JCB thing, right? Now, if I had gone on during promotions, oh, this is science fiction, etc., that would not have happened. But then when it was time to pitch the book abroad, of course, this is near future science fiction set in India, please buy. It helps to be as genre fluid as possible because this is not a world where anyone particularly wants Indian fantasy or science fiction. So what genre, anything I do in is pretty dependent on what the story is. I let what the story is define what it is. The next few things will be another shift towards fantasy. The next one is kind of exactly halfway between SF and fantasy. And that's a border again that I don't particularly care about. But I think I'm going to slowly pivot again back towards fantasy.
And do you think you'll revisit some of your older worlds?
I want to, but it becomes a question of it being increasingly challenging to do this for a living. It becomes a logistical thing. So, for example, if anything of mine gets picked up for an adaptation, which multiple times has threatened to happen, but the moment it becomes viable in any pragmatic way to do more work in the game world, for example, I will go back and do more work in the game world because that is something that I would be interested in revisiting 20 years later just to see what the experience of it is like. Similarly, for the Turbulence books, The City Inside, I will probably not do sequels to, at least for the next few years, because the research is really depressing. I did not enjoy doing the research. I enjoyed writing the book and rewriting it multiple times. But the research is really bleak. Why inflict that on myself when the world is inflicting on all of us on a daily basis anyway, is my thought.
Well, left to my own devices, we'd be here discussing the game world for at least another hour. So before we go any further, I'd like to invite you to do a reading from The City Inside.
I'll read a little bit. I always fall asleep when other people are reading from their work, even if they're really good. Sometimes Joey feels like her whole life is a montage of randomly selected, algorithm-controlled surveillance cam clips, mostly of her looking at screens or sitting glazed eyes at meetings. As a professional image builder and storyteller, she finds the lack of structure even more offensive than the banality of the material. She's always taken pride in her instinct for cuts and angles and rhythms in the wildly successful stories she produces. One day, one perfect day, her life will be just as award-worthy. As she heads into the park near her parents' house for her regular Sunday morning run, actually, the first in 3 months, but she's finally managed to wake up early this time. It's usually way too hot to be outside the house by the time she reaches Little Bengal for her weekly visit. She finds herself idly building another montage in her mind. A classic training sequence where she builds an incredible body through first failing and then succeeding at the same task, intercut with determined running, some weights, an optional animal sidekick, rounded off with a motivational hop soundtrack. Even the idea is tiring, and she considers going straight to her parents' house. It's already hot enough to make her eyes twitch. Instead, she goes through her fitness checklist. Headphones in place, cooling sportswear hopefully working as much as possible in Delhi, smog/plague max mask already making her face sweat, water bottle and pepper spray in the right slots on her smart belt, a few stretches, and she's off along the jogging track, keeping a wary eye out for battling stray dogs and monkeys lurking in the trees. The track's distance markers are all in place, the fascist uncle laughing club shouting national pride slogans while leering at her, the neighborhood wives ambling along in large groups shouting to be heard over the blaring devotional music on their phones, workers attempting their weekly repair of the park's mysteriously smashed surveillance cams. She sees the column on her third lap when she slows down for a second to catch her breath. It's a simple one, a basic floral pattern with embedded hashtags drawn on a cement patch next to a manhole cover in blue chalk. Joey quickly checks to see the nearest park cam is disabled, takes a picture of the column and uploads it to a decoder app which tells her in a second about the protest. It's an invite for. Another slum is being evacuated by the police and builder militia. It's not far. It's the neighborhood where Lakshmi, her parents' domestic helper, used to live before she moved to Kalkaji with her boyfriend, a cyber bazaar shop owner. The app tells her this protest's potential bloodshed rating is extremely high. There's a cheerful, wiggly blood drop icon.
Thank you. That was great. And I particularly love the cheerful blood icon.
It has to be cheerful.
Before we get into it, really, I wanted to ask, so Chosen Spirits is now the city inside. Can you tell us a bit about how that came to be, what the process was like?
As in the process of moving into America or like the title change?
Both.
Turbulence had gotten UK and US publishing deals around a decade ago. So the process to moving into the West was something that I was kind of familiar with. It's very tedious. You basically write to lots of agents and you wait. It helped in various stages that, the book did well in India and it had got this award nomination. And because I'm ancient and some people in the West know my work already, it had gotten reviewed in some of the, SF fantasy magazines and so on. So all of that kind of helped eventually, even though it was not a book that I had thought America would want or that America thought that America would want. The collective momentum of things ensured that it got read by a few people, and fortunately, some people liked it. And when I say some people liked it, I have to say that Tor.com has been my dream publisher for a long time. So I'm not downplaying that at all because I love their whole list. Tor had sent me one of my first rejections back when I was in my early 20s. So it was nice to, after many, many years, kind of get in through that gate in a shifty way. The title change was basically because my agent and my publishers told me that Chosen Spirits in the US would be seen as this kind of evangelical spiritual book. Like that was the kind of projection that it would give to people who were just looking at the title, which I did not want. We landed at the new title, which I like.
I don't know whether I'm unsophisticated or perhaps not evangelical enough because I immediately was like, alcohol, spirits. Yeah, sure.
Right. While I'm happy to have that kind of association, I don't know whether it's good for sales.
So getting into the book, one of the things that struck me straight away is how overtly political it is. And you would mention that it's quite observant. It is a book written about times which are very familiar to us, despite being set in this future that, is quite dire, actually, when you think about it. So what made you want to mirror our, in air quotes, reality so much?
Well, I think the book mostly grew out of my own anxieties and fears about the future. And what happens is that whenever I have an idea of any sort, my first thought is, can I make a book out of this? Because ideas, I don't have a lot. So, which is what led to the research for the book. And initially I planned something quite different. I planned a much larger book, which was sort of in 3 parts with a decade in between them. And there would be this, this growing futuristic component. And we would be building up towards various revolutions and action bits and much, much larger in scope and scale, but also much more SF, let's say. Like the last segment would have been set in the 2050s and things would have changed a lot. But because of what was going on in the country during the whole process of researching this book and then writing it, and I started researching this book in, I think, 2016 or so, 2015, 2016, it became harder to pretend that either a revolution of some sort or some kind of technological change of some sort would actively be able to change the reality of what's happening in our country at this point of time. Because what we've seen and what we're seeing with a lot more clarity and starkness over the last few years, especially, is that first, the rate of change of society, of everything, is always going to be faster than we can kind of capture and comprehend. So we're always going to be kind of chasing it. And the other thing is that, just as technology or political change, we don't really have much agency in what's happening in the country. We don't have any control over it. There's very little that we can do to kind of alter the course of history. We don't have that chosen one spirit amongst ourselves as well. We're very aware of the constraints on us. So it felt a little false to pretend that advanced technology, which we've seen in our country, it does as much to control and constrain and observe people as it does to free them or enable them in any way. It does both things, but at a wider scale, we are seeing technology being used much more as a tool of oppression and division and breakdown of institutions. So it became increasingly uncomfortable for me to pretend, even in fiction, when I was drawing so much of this material out from the real world, from people I knew and from the news and all of that. It felt wrong to make it escapist, which is why the lead characters became people who did not have the power to change the world. And so their challenge was really just coping with the world that they were in and trying to find themselves and trying to find ways to both adjust to shifting realities and also make them better, not just for themselves, but for the people that they cared about in whatever way. So the impact of the actions of the people in the book is quite small. And I don't pretend that they're going to be, the leaders of the revolution or Luke Skywalker in any sense. So I completely dropped the latter two sections of the book and tried to focus completely on what was kind of either 10 minutes or 10 years in the future, but essentially look at the experience of being alive in the world and place that we are now. And in terms of it being political, I have to say that what is significant for me, at least, is all the ways it's not political. In the sense that, yes, of course, it's political because anything we're talking about the current place and time is political, but I thought that it would be better to constrain myself a lot in terms of whose experiences and whose points of views I was looking through, because it would feel very exploitative to look, for example, through the eyes of a very underprivileged person, right? So therefore, no Dalit POV characters, no Muslim POV characters, because if I can't imagine the experiences that people in the real world in the present day are going through, then who am I to imagine their experiences in an imaginary future that is drawn from the present? I mean, I had to spend a lot of time thinking about whether Joey, the primary protagonist, would be a woman as well, because even there's a whole set of experiences which, it's mildly appropriative for me to even be drawing from. But I figured that since most of the people I know who this person would be in real life are women who I know very well, it would make more sense for her to be a woman, which is why she's one. There's a lot of real world present day politics that I don't discuss for reasons that are of personal safety and the book's safety as well. I don't want to take too much credit for the book being political when I have chosen to be silent about so many things.
I think one of the more fascinating aspects of the book for me personally was this kind of relationship that both Joey and Rudra had with the status quo. Because Joey, despite having a streak of idealism, is quite a pragmatic person. She is part of the system in a very real way, even though she decides to be behind the camera rather than front of it. But she is manipulating the system and working in it. And there is a sense of, I want to say, hopelessness to it also. Why did you put her behind the camera, controlling things in a way when she actually really doesn't have that much control?
Because it's kind of a situation that we're all in, right? This book is about people who are privileged enough to look away and have successful lives, as opposed to people who are in the heart of political violence and political conflict and kind of face the keenest edge of social change or technological change. I think for a lot of people, and especially for people who are in a place where they are able to read fiction, where they have the time and space and the privilege it takes to read fiction in the world we live in India now. I thought these would be the conflicts that both as a writer and as a reader would be in the realm of familiarity for the people who would be engaging with this work. Because I didn't want to do any tourism. Having done this for many years, I know 5 or 6 things I can do to make this book much more sellable in the West. I didn't want to do any of those things.
Also, something that I found interesting was the contrast between Joey and Rudra and their way of looking at things. Like, for example, Joey to me felt very kind of middle class, protected from the bloodshed, but not completely unaware. And Rudra, on the other hand, grew up in this kind of rarefied wealth and like had all this opportunity for access and privilege, but voluntarily turns his back on it and is very idealistic, despite having a front row seat to a lot of the more corrupt happenings in the country. And why did you choose to portray him that way? He's very idealistic to the point of being stupidly naive.
Yeah. So I wanted to look at the different degrees of disengagement that were possible for characters in these respective classes. So I wasn't looking at the severely underprivileged. I was looking at one, your upper middle class person, who's your protagonist, and your upper class person, who's your secondary protagonist. Joey cannot afford the kind of disengagement that Rudra can, because both by economic circumstances and by the very fact of her gender, no one is going to give her that much space to go off and be by yourself. There are freedoms that Rudra is given by his privilege and by his gender and by the family that he comes from, which makes distancing himself from the crux of family activities possible. Right. So it's like that classical Indian thing where we'll send the boy off for 2-3 years to Europe to study in some university and let him do what he likes. Then he will come back and run the family business and get married to a girl of our choice. There is that window of go and sow your wild oats, which Indian rich boys are given. His idealism comes from theory. And his idealism comes from turning his back away to the stuff that his family is doing. And as often happens in any privileged Indian section of society, it's like, yeah, you please go and have your period of having all these nice ideals, and then you come back and you run the family business. And then you will have neither those ideals nor the time to think about such things, whatever it is that you want to do. And so for Rudra, the starting point of the story where they come together really is the point where this is happening for him, where it's like your old life, where your holiday from reality is now over. So the reason for the choice of these two characters is that I wanted to look at the extremely privileged and the safely but not extremely privileged section of society in the world that we were in.
And they both end up taking very different routes to revolution and change. And I think that's very reflective of their circumstances also. You do mention chosen one syndrome, which is something that I think Joey's mother kind of brings up to her and says, you were never brought up to think that you were the chosen one. And because of that, their roads diverge in a really big way. Was it important to show him being kind of this all or nothing, I'm willing to throw everything away in this very extreme way? Was that crucial to how you would imagine the characters and their journey moving forward?
Yeah, it was in a sense. I think the acts of courage and resistance and revolution and all of that are very sharply indexed by the background that you're from. So when we look at, for example, a lot of Western, further Eastern hero literature, it usually comes from people who are writing from a completely safe space where they think that systems work, where they don't have anyone to take care of, where the consequences of their actions, it's all along a very individual prism, you know? So for Joey, for example, if you were told you have to fix the world right now, Anjali, what do you do? I think among your first set of thoughts is, how does this impact the people I'm close to? What risks does it put them under? And so for a lot of people who, from a Western critical point of view, or even an Indian critical point of view, you might call them a passive character, are actually people who are constrained by the social paradigms that they come from. Rudra is not constrained by those paradigms because he is from extreme privilege. He's male. He's got all the money that he wants. So he's able to take further leaps because of privilege of his background. With Joey is not. But that doesn't essentially make any action undertaken by anyone more or less heroic or more or less brave. It's just that you do what you can within the realm of possibility that you are constrained by. And a lot of it was really about wondering, what can we do? You know, you and I, or the people we know, what can we do to make the world better? And the answer is usually it's not a lot, unless you throw yourself off a cliff of risk and go into strange lands and do strange things you have no familiarity with. It's not something you can plan. it's perfectly legit to feel guilt about that. But there should be a constraint on the amount of guilt you are able to feel, because when you're looking at SF or fantasy as an act of engagement rather than an act of escape, these are both things that this kind of literature does. And I love books with both of these things. But if you're drawing from reality, as this book does, at every chapter, I was tempted to give Joey superpowers, or have her discover a robot, or have a secret organization contact her and say, here is a metal glove, and with this metal glove, you can fix everything. So not doing that was an important part of this book.
And I think something that's very apparent in the book, and you've brought it out really beautifully, is the disconnect between the various aspects of Indian society. Like, there is this kind of life of glamour and endless money, these people are pulling the strings. And then there's a very different kind of glamour of the flow stars and whoever's in front of the screen influencing people. There's all these references to the real India and the India that these people are not connected to at all. And all these asides of all this actual violence and dark stuff continuing to happen despite all this glamour. And I think Joey, at least, is quite aware that she's not as connected as she probably should be. And I think that's something that a lot of particularly young urban Indians could probably identify with.
I hope so, because, a lot of this also for me has been very personal, because I've been engaging with influencer culture for the last 20 years. Because I think I was in my early 20s when I was thrown into, however small and nebulous, some kind of fame. And because I've kind of worked with Bollywood for a decade and a half, worked in comics, worked in the media and all of that, both the disconnect and the bubble that is created by fame, influence, prosperity on the one hand, and your settings on the other, has been personally fascinating. So a lot of the stuff that is in The City Inside is also in Simoquin, because both are backstage narratives on heroes' journeys. I've been watching influencer culture in its various forms, evolve, mutate, and emerge as Godzilla in India over the last 20 years. And so this is something that I've always been thinking about. So this is something that I've been familiar with for a long time, and dealing with it is both bleak and funny.
Social media plays a big part in this whole story. In fact, probably the most defining aspect of it. Why did you choose something like flow and flow star? Like, that's a very specific aspect of social media that you've centered in this book.
Well, I think that's what we're headed, right? Like, that's where we're headed. I think there will be a coming together of, your propaganda and your controlled media and your celebrity news announcements, completely divorced from supposed field of expertise or supposed area of operation, and the increased kind of staged managedness of public reality. If you look at the acceleration that's happened over the last 10, 15 years, I think where we will be in 10 years, the line, I've taken quite a conservative view of it. I set in an influencer culture dominated space because, again, that's a space that I'm familiar with. I feel like I've met all the people in this book, with a few obvious exceptions. I set this in the fields I set it in and made the central characters who they are, because they're people I know in the real world. And it became important to me to be as, to have one round of connection with everything in the book to make this book what it was.
I also found it fascinating that what you've described in the book is a surveillance state, really. There are like tons of small cameras that they find all over the house. Someone is always monitoring them. And then on the other hand, you have something like the flow, where people are constantly and voluntarily putting themselves out there and like giving away the privacy. So, I mean, that contrast is actually what resonated the most with me in the book. And why did you choose to focus on something like that?
Because it's kind of the world we already live in, right? Like the thing I described about small cameras everywhere, it's already happened in Korea, for example, whatever. There's been huge scandals because people have been putting these little cameras in ladies' toilets and wherever else to just creep on people and make the best use to them of their really sharp broadband spectrum. We obviously live in a surveillance state already. The thing is, it's inefficient. And 10 years later from now, it will be less inefficient. We already don't know where our data is going and who's looking at it. Governments, oligarchs, criminals. algorithms, whatever it is, it's just going to be more of this. And in India, thing is, we don't adhere to any one system of surveillance, right? We have a very everything, everywhere, all at once kind of approach to it. And we already live in multiple realities. And I find this fascinating because even the most data conscious of us and the people most concerned with their own privacy and all of that have absolutely no control over what data they're giving out. You can choose to put a sticker on your laptop camera and you think you're safe, but you're not. You will still find that your Instagram is delivering customized content to you based on conversations you just had in another room. What the near future will give us is more control over the already present difficulties in our life. Not more control, but more measurement of the already existing problems in our life. And so this was, that weirdness of understanding that you're being watched, but not really knowing what the consequences of that are, or who's doing the watching, or any of these parties having any accountability to you or your supposed representatives in any way.
The parasocial relationships that you've depicted are also, like I said, familiar, but at the same time taken to another extreme. I could see it being our reality in 10 years from now.
Oh yeah, it'll be worse. I say cheerfully.
I know, so cheerful. Something else you explored really in a very nuanced and interesting way is the power dynamics between all these characters and the reality of where privilege takes you. For example, like Zarya using her political connections to kind of release these sensational truths, but being sheltered from perhaps the same consequences that another journalist would face. Or Tara, who's weaponizing her popularity on the flow, inch her way up on the status ladder. Or, even Rudra, who's voluntarily choosing poverty over conformity. What you're looking at is people with choices making very big choices. And I thought that was very interesting because, like you said, you haven't chosen to depict the underprivileged. But there's a very clear line between privilege and consequences. And I found that very interesting because it's something that I don't think gets discussed enough.
Thank you. It's really good to hear you talk about this because this was entirely what made the book not a thriller, shall we say. Because it's very hard to put this stuff in fiction and also retain a fast-moving plot with your kind of cinematic high points. So this was one of the choices that was harder to make. But it also helped steer matters that these were all people I know. I mean, present day life, as it makes everything more complicated. And even on social media, the sheer range of opinions ranging from hot takes to actual expertise that you're confronted with every time you open a discussion on any subject. We should also add that thanks to this beloved lockdown that we were just all in for the last 2 years, there has been a lot more time and need to think about things. So whenever something of kind of earth-shaking and probably society-shaking importance happens and then disappears the next day, because now every day something happens that should change the course of history forever, but then doesn't, because the next day's thing comes. These questions of who is allowed to say what and do what, and the hidden backstories of the people that you admire, the more you find out about them, and through kind of access to at least the friends of famous people for the last 2 decades, it has been a consistent sequence of revelations about where people's courage comes from and where people's silence comes from. And these all coalesce very effectively into slabs of privilege in an almost kind of statistical way. Suddenly, everyone ceases to be a fascinating individual and becomes a part of a demographic sect. While, of course, having their unique brand proposition carefully customized to be slightly different from everyone else's, but recognizable.
And I think because of that, also because of the portrayal of privilege, the conversations that were also being had in the book were very familiar to me, because a lot of the times I do feel that the voices that we hear that are the loudest are very privileged ones, right? Because of access and because of just how the way the world is set out, like even today. And, some of the conversations in the book, which are, identity politics, the Me Too movement, diversity, cancel culture, everybody loves cancel culture. and caste and class. Why was it so important to you to kind of touch on these things in this book, which is technically set in a dystopian future?
That I don't think the book is dystopian at all. But everyone else has, so I've been like, fine, it's dystopian then. But it's certainly not dystopian in where I'm coming from, because I really thought I was writing a optimistic but pragmatic office comedy with some drama. So when I had like 100% dystopian response to it, like, fine, I suppose it's not nice where they're living and things are a bit harsh. But I did not see it that way at all. I blame my research, right? Because I really took the nicest path possible given the scenarios of the future that have been painted once applied to this part of the world, plus observations of the way society currently is. To be dystopian, you have to be outside it. Right? Like you have to be like a white person reading The Handmaid's Tale and thinking, I'm also so glad this could never happen to me. Whereas it's happening to millions of women around the world right now. But again, you choose to look away. So it's not dystopian if you're living in the middle of that society, even if you have the relative privilege to be sitting and writing about it instead of experiencing it face first. I also think that, and this is a harsh thing to say, but I think a few of the things that happened in the backstory of this book over the decade that we've skipped over are much nicer than what reality is going to bring us. I really see it as kind of pragmatic and not dystopian. This is a book where people are looking for ways to cope and ways to hope throughout, whereas I find a lot of dystopian fiction very kind of edgelordy in the way it goes, haha, this is horrible, eat it, which I'm consciously trying to avoid. So that's where it came from, really. A lot of this book was not pragmatic at all from a publishing point of view, but just trying to put down in words the things that I think I am and people I know are going through. And it's not an approach that I've taken to books before, because several of the incentives for me for any book I've previously written have been, where do I find the fun in this? Where are the dragons? Where are, superhero fights that go through a tower? How can I escape from the relative dullness of the real world? So it was very interesting for me to kind of go in the opposite direction. I don't know whether this is what I'll do with future books, because it'll really depend on the time and place that the book is being written in. But given the times that we were living in now, it seemed a little off to, write about the magical rabbit, though that would have been much more fun.
How very Neo of us following the white rabbit. And another very important, in my opinion, relationship that I wanted to touch on was Joey's with her parents. And they really seem to be her grounding force and definitely shaped who she is as a person. There's mentions of taking her along to protests, engaging her in a dialogue when she's very young about our freedoms, where we are as a country. And now, 10 years later, there's a kind of switch up in the parent-child relationship where she is the one who is sheltering them and protecting them from the harsh realities of what this country has become. And was that an important part of the book for you?
Yeah, I mean, on various levels, it was quite crucial for me, because Joey's parents are my generation. Joey's generation is the kids I'm seeing at protests or on the internet now, who, despite their supposed disconnection from everything and their individual culture, people who are speaking up, who are showing up, despite not having any incentive to do so in the times we now live in. We often tend to look at past generations with this fairly dismissive eye. But all the battles for freedom in its various forms have been fought by each generation in their own way. So that was one part of it. The other was, I realized when Snapchat came that I had hit a technological wall. I was looking at this with an understanding of what it was, but a complete lack of understanding of why. And I was looking at Snapchat and thinking, okay, so Instagram was actually the last thing that I vaguely understood. And whatever happens forward from here is going to be like my elderly relatives trying to figure out what the internet is. Like, there is just a fundamental lack of ability to understand what the thing is, right? So I wanted Joey's parents, who were my generation again, to be past the point of their own comprehension. Because really, the country that I was promised when I was in my teens and early 20s and the country that we are in now are wholly different countries. And I see people who are my age completely switching off at this point because they cannot understand the difference in realities between what they were promised and what has happened. And I've now seen people my age having tech explained to them by their kids, or having their children really say, oh my God, you guys will never get it. I also became part of it because it is a very strange thing for me to feel old. Over the last 2 decades, I've gone from always being the youngest person in the room to now I feel like I'm on the cusp of being last generation. So it's a very interesting experience, and it's also fun. So if I'm anyone in this book, primarily I'm Joey's parents. Increasingly, when I find myself watching rom-coms or whatever, I find myself identifying more with the worried parents than I do with the dashing character. Like I was watching Miss Marvel the other day and think, I am the uncle here, right? I am the dad or the mom. And that is so weird. I want this girl to come home and stay safe. That's what I want. I don't want her to be Miss Marvel. So that experience also was part of what made Joey's parents what they were in the book.
But also, I think Joey's parents are a wonderful depiction of how people can kind of lose steam as time goes by, because idealism can crumble quite understandably when it feels like a losing battle on every front. And I thought that depiction of them was really lovely because it is kind to them also, because it's not holding them in contempt for kind of settling into the status quo, but also showing that side of things.
No, thank you. And it was important actually for me to be kind to previous generations because, again, SF and fantasy are not kind to parents. They're usually killed off immediately to prevent home constraints for the individuals ruggedly seeking their way to glory, or their arranged marriage parents from 80s movies, where all they represent is the voice of cruel authority that doesn't understand anything. But these people are alive and they're not that old in this world, and they're very betrayed by what's happened to them.
I mean, you have a really lovely cast of very interesting supporting characters. I particularly like the K-drama influence, just the idea of like these flow shows and like things like that. Those are the details that kind of keep you looking. There's a hint at like kind of a foreign interference coming in. Like there's talk of Korea and China. Is that something you're going to explore further?
Not at all. I hope not to write a sequel ever to this book. I'm just saying it would be interesting, right? But it's so depressing, Anjali, to research this book. I can't tell you. Everything is so horrible. The futurist books I read are just casually predicting the end of the world in so many different directions, and then tying it all together. It's like Black Mirror. At least you're dealing with one problem at a time, right? Now, world building for this book is like 11 Black Mirror episodes happening at the same time, which is what life is like, right? So it's so horrible to put it all together and then trying to keep these people who you care about safe, while you're going through it. I don't know, felt more for my character. Like in my youth, I was casually killing off characters left and right with the kind of detached sociopathy of a George R.R. Martin, right? Kill those people, doesn't matter. I'm like, oh my God, I just want you to be safe, which is perhaps another function of being elderly.
That was a great response, by the way, because my next question was going to be, do you think there will be a sequel? And I think you've answered it quite handily.
I don't want there to be a sequel. Like, I'm actively dreading writing a sequel to this book because I know the story for it also. Like I've plotted out all three parts of the book I was planning to write. I don't want to write it. It's very bleak. I don't want to do it.
We do live in, as they say, cursedly interesting times. Do you think now writing is going to be a lot more escapism for you?
I certainly hope so. So I was talking to Divya about this. And she also, after Machinehood, she's doing this vast space opera thing, which she just announced. Over the last couple of years, the more I've been engaging with writers in other parts of the world who have also done near future fiction, one thing that has really caused a lot of bonding is that, oh my God, the research is so depressing. And both the internal expectations and outward denial of any need for accurate prediction is such unnecessary pressure. And it just feels so compressing. It's like those things where there's where water is rising and you're trying to figure out a way out of the walls of the enclosing chamber in the tomb of the pharaoh. that everyone just wants to do something big and fun after, instead of trying to like micromanage the details of the news of next week.
We are big fans of Divya's, and yet, as you mentioned, I think her work in machinehood also predicts, it mirrors quite closely the idea of like the surveillance and like the way things are going rapidly downhill.
But she, at least because she's smarter than I am, she didn't throw herself as close to the mess as I did. She left herself some room to pontificate about AI and look at larger concepts instead of, oh my God, we are in this already. Where do we go? Which was my situation throughout writing this book, which I have complimented Divya on. But even from the relative freedom that she gave herself, she's seeking escape from that as well. And I am too. I want to write something big and fun and escapist, and then see over the years whether I want to come back to this sort of space again.
On that very cheerful note, I think we should wrap up. But I also wanted to ask you what we can look forward to from you in 2022, 23, if there's any big projects on the horizon.
Well, 23, I have another book coming out from Tor.com, which is a big kind of sci-fi fantasy crossover adventure. I mean, it has serious themes and all of that, but it also has all the kind of plot twists and action things that I made myself leave out of this book. Doing it, I can't really talk much more about it because I have to wait for the announcement, but that's what's happening. Otherwise, there's really not much else going on. I'm theoretically working on a couple of films and so on, but those you never know until they come out whether you were actually ever working on them or not. So even if they're announced, it doesn't really mean they're happening. So I just have learned over the years to keep quiet about them. There is one film that probably won't happen, which I'm having great fun avoiding at the moment, which is one like big star superhero movie, which I have been trying to get out of doing, but they have for some reason decided I'm the person to do.
Oh, Samit, you are the chosen one.
Please no. Thank you, though.
But that is much better news than what we were talking about just before. So we'll be looking out for that. And hopefully we can have you back when that comes out.
Thank you, Anjali. And it was an absolute pleasure chatting with you. And you were extremely tolerant of my multi-directional rambling. So a special thank you for that.
Follow Samit on Twitter @Samit Basu. Arcx is a series of the Subverse, the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagining futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. Follow us on social media @Dark and Light Zine or at darkandlight.com for episode details and show notes.